In this video, we're going to show you how to master the model painting technique called dry brushing. Not only that, we're going to show you some common mistakes and how to fix them, best practices, what brushes to use, some cleaning tips, as well as some more advanced ways you can use dry brushing too. To demonstrate, we'll be using a variety of miniatures, including some from Ravaged Star, who have kindly sponsored this video. Dry brushing can give you amazing results really quickly, and is quite a beginner-friendly technique. Even if you've been painting for ages, dry brushing is a fantastic time saver, especially if you're a bit of a lazy painter like me, or if you have trouble keeping your hands steady for careful, dainty edge highlighting. You can use dry brushing to highlight details, add pre-shading, to blend colours. It's basically a cheat code for miniature painting. Essentially, all you have to do is get a little bit of paint on your brush, rub most of it off so barely any paint is left on the brush, waggle it around over your minis, and watch the magic happen. Okay, that's it. See you next time. Haha, gotcha. There is a little bit more to it than that. So let's start with the basics and what paints, brushes, and other stuff you'll need to get going. In terms of paint, dry brushing works best with acrylic paints. You can use any acrylic paint really, even cheap craft stuff will do the job. But you'll get more consistent results with paints that have been specifically made for miniature painting. Brands like Citadel, AK, TT Combat, the Army Painter, there are dozens and dozens, but they all should give you good results. Some brands have special, very thin, liquid paints like Citadel's Contrast and Shade paints, Army Painter's Speed paints, and Vallejo's Express range, which you don't want to use. These will be too wet, not opaque, and not deposit pigment on your minis in the right way. You might have seen that Citadel make a specific dry paint line, but in our experience it's not actually any better than regular paint for dry brushing, and the pots that we own have actually totally dried up already, so you might want to avoid gimmicky stuff like this and just stick with regular acrylic paints. Now let's talk about the type of brush you're going to need. For most applications, a good dry brush will look like this. A bit larger and blunter than the kind of paintbrush you'd usually use for painting base coats on a mini, for example. You can also buy specific brushes that are shaped like this already, but this is a good case for not throwing out your old split and messy brushes. With a little trim, they can be perfect for dry brushing, saving you money and giving your old hobby tools a new lease of life. There are a few hobby and art brands that make dedicated dry brushes too, which have a lovely round shape and nice stiff bristles, but if you're hobbying on a tighter budget, you can get great results out of makeup brushes. These tend to be synthetic and have softer bristles, but are far, far cheaper than the hobby brand alternatives. In terms of shape, there's no real right answer here. It kind of depends on your preference, which you'll develop as you get more and more experienced with the technique, and also depends on what you're actually painting. Round brushes are better for all-over strokes and softer highlighting, and flat brushes are better for directional strokes, which creates a harsher highlight. You'll also need a couple of things beside paint and brushes. First, you'll need a surface to wipe the paint off your brush. This can be a piece of kitchen roll, a cloth, a palette, a table that no one will mind you covering in paint, or a texture mat to wipe excess paint on. You might also want a separate paint palette to get your paint ready to dry brush on. You'll want some water to clean your brushes, and obviously a mini that you want to dry brush. Now, the first and arguably the most important step for dry brushing isn't anything to do with the brush or the paint or the technique. It's making sure that your model is clean, free of mold lines, and primed. Mold lines are those ridgy lines that run all over your minis, left over from when they were being made. There are loads of ways to remove them, and most can be gently scraped off using the blunt back edge of a hobby knife like this. Sometimes you might find it easier to use a sponge file, like the kind you use for manicures. The danger of ignoring this step is that any mold lines left on your minis will get caught by your brush and end up very highlighted, and you don't want them sticking out like a sore thumb. Once your model is looking nice and clean, it's also really important to prime it. You can use a brush-on primer, or an airbrush primer, or, my preference, a rattle can primer. It doesn't really matter so long as you apply one of them. The primer will give the paint you apply on top of it something to stick to, making it more robust, not just for handling and playing games with, but for more abrasive painting techniques like dry brushing. I've made the mistake in the past of not applying a primer, and I found that when I dry brushed on top of the regular base coat painted on the raw plastic, some of the base coat layer rubbed off, exposing the plastic underneath. Obviously not ideal. So now you've got your clean, primed Mini ready to go. Let's do some dry brushing. For starters, let me show you the basics with these Imari Shield Wardens from Ravaged Star, which have been primed black. Just to make it really clear and obvious what we're doing here, I'll be using white to dry brush them. So let's get a little bit of paint onto our palette, and first up I'm going to show you the most common way people tend to dry brush. Not necessarily the best way, but the one that most people do, especially when they're new to miniature painting. Tap the tip of your brush into the paint, wipe away the excess paint on your palette so we can still use it later, and then try to remove as much of the paint as possible on a dry, absorbent surface like a piece of kitchen paper or a rag until almost no paint seems to come off. At that point, we're ready. Now, moving over to the model, start sweeping your brush gently over the surface of the model. You should notice that, seemingly by magic, the details start appearing with a soft white highlight. It's not magic though, it's just that the tiny amount of paint that's still left on the brush starts catching against the raised details on the model, accentuating them, and adding highlights while leaving the hard to reach spots and crevices nice and dark still. If absolutely nothing is coming off after a few brushes over, or if the effect is too subtle, then you need to get a little bit more paint back on the bristles, but be careful not to add too much. So there we go, basic dry brushing, simple as that. Now let me quickly show you one of the most common mistakes straight away, and that's what happens if you don't remove enough paint before you start dry brushing. Let's do it on the back of this model. Same as before, but I'm going to be a bit less thorough when removing the paint on the rag. Now we can see when I start dry brushing, I'm leaving way more of a streaky pattern, which looks more like brush strokes than just a subtle texture of highlights building up. This is still a useful painting technique, usually called overbrushing, because you can lay down a decent layer of paint without going into the recesses, but because it's a little bit less subtle than dry brushing, that technique is mostly used on things like terrain pieces or things with very weathered armor, which we'll touch on again later in the video. The fun thing about having some identical models here is that I can show you what a visual difference changing certain things will make. First, let's show you the difference that using a slightly damp brush rather than a bone dry brush makes. This is where having the water nearby comes in handy. Now, you don't want to totally soak the brush, just dab it on a little bit of moist kitchen paper to prime the bristles with a tiny bit of moisture. Wipe the brush on something absorbent just to make sure there isn't too much water on the brush, and now just follow the same steps as we did before. Dabby into the paint, wipe away the paint on something absorbent until nothing is visibly coming off, and then move over to the model and gently sweep back and forth. As you can see, the results are very similar, but the newer one is definitely a bit smoother and more subtle, don't you think? The truth is, this isn't necessarily better. There are times you'll want the result on the left, and times you'll want the result on the right. But at least now you know you can get both of these different looks by just slightly dampening the brush beforehand. While we're at it, here's two quick tips that I think are absolutely essential for good dry brushing. First, when you've got a directional texture, like the feathers on this helmet plume, sweep your brush against the direction of the texture. That way the texture will be caught and really stand out. If you go in the same direction as the texture, your brush will go into the recesses, making the whole thing look a bit messy and much less contrasty. Also, if you've got thin, fiddly, fragile bits on your model, be careful because dry brushing is a bit rougher than regular painting, so brace these parts with your finger so they don't flex or waggle around too much. This will save you loads of frustration gluing tiny bits together later. Doing this basic grayscale dry brush highlighting with grey or white over a black base coat is the first step in the popular mini painting technique, sometimes called underpainting, pre-shading, or slap chalk, where you apply transparent paints over the top of a model that's already been highlighted like this, which helps define shadows and highlights a bit better than just doing it all over the top of a flat white base coat. This video isn't about that technique though, this is about dry brushing, so let's keep on topic. Now even experienced painters will sometimes do this, accidentally splodge a big wet bit of paint that was hiding in the brush onto your beautifully painted model. It happens, it sucks, but there's a way to avoid this. Basically, give yourself a test area on something else that you can do a quick bit of dry brushing on first, just to make sure you've got the right amount of paint on the brush. This can be anything with a bit of texture really. There are some companies that sell dedicated texture palettes, but to be honest, there are tons of free alternatives out there. You can literally prime anything that has a bit of texture and use that as a dry brush tester. A stone, a bit of scrap wood, a chunk of garden slate, a bark chip. Get it primed with the same primer you use on your models and treat it like a little painting pal. Give it a name if you like, who am I to judge? Now, people judge me all the time for the state of my dry palette. It has hundreds of caked on layers of paint and primer, but honestly, this thing works great for testing out dry brushing too. Instead of cleaning it down to the metal or plastic after each project, just prime your hard palette using the same rattle can spray you'd use for your models. I love this method and have used it for years, so don't be afraid to give it a try yourself. Another way of making a slightly more thematic dry brush palette is to use bits of sprue and spare model parts, all hot glued down to some MDF or a tile or something else flat and rigid. Again, just prime it and voila! A cheeky little texture palette to test out your dry brushing on so you don't accidentally ruin your models. Now, speaking of models, what do you think about the models we've used so far? These have been from Ravaged Star, a new tabletop wargame and miniature line from our pals at Mini Wargaming. I reckon they make really fantastic minis for new painters. First, they've got tons of cool sculpted textures and fun details that come up beautifully with techniques like dry brushing and using one-coat paints like Contrast, Speed Paint, Express, stuff like that. Second, they're durable plastic models that come pre-assembled, so you don't have to spend hours and hours cleaning and building your models before you can even paint them. Third, even though they have their own game, the models are also great for running as proxies in more widespread games like Warhammer 40k. The Veil Touch make great Chaos Space Marines, the Amari are a cool swap out for the Leagues of Votan, and the Gorkog are a ferocious replacement for the Tyranids. And fourth, they're actually surprisingly affordable. If you're used to having to fork out 100 quid for 12 infantry models, you might like the thought of spending the same amount of money but getting 52 miniatures instead. Anyway, I like them, and I think you will too. Go follow the link in the description and check out their awesome pre-order bundles, and let them know I sent you. They even do awesome tanks like this that come pre-built with loads of optional extras to just clip in place. No need to glue or use magnets, just swap out the bits that you want depending on what loadout you want in your game. Now, you might think that big boxy stuff like this with lots of flat areas might be challenging to dry brush, and you'd be right. It is more of a challenge, but there are ways to get awesome results even when dry brushing big armor panels too. Let me show you. The key with painting big flat panels with dry brushing is to accept that we're going to need to spice it up a bit and not just paint the whole area in the same way. We're going to want to create some focal points on the upper edges of the vehicle where the colours will be lighter than they are at the bottom of the panel. First up, let's decide on a colour. I'm going to go for a cool toned slate blue, and whatever you choose to go for, you want to have at least 2, ideally 3 or 4 paint colours to create a tonal transition. Now don't worry, you don't have to go out and buy all new paints. You can mix some colours up beforehand if you like. I'm going to use these 3 paints here. Storm Grey for my darkest colour, Overcast Blue for my mid-tone, and Snow Blue for my lightest highlight. First off, I primed the Mini black, so that all recesses, nooks and crannies will be very dark. Now this seems like a pretty good time to touch on overbrushing again, which could be considered like dry brushing's messier cousin, because that's what we're going to be doing for the first darker colour, which is going to be Storm Grey for me. Do exactly the same thing as you would with your basic dry brush steps, but instead of removing as much paint as possible, just stop about here, where the paint has been worked into the brush, but it's still leaving behind plenty of paint on whatever you're working the paint off on or testing the brush out on. Now we can apply the paint in the same way as dry brushing, but the paint will go on less subtly, creating a more solid base coat than just dry brushing would, while still leaving some of the darkness in the recesses and hard to reach spots. Nothing fancy, just making sure all the black surfaces are either totally covered with this colour or at least tinted with it towards the bottom. But as you can see, there's still plenty of black still visible in the cracks, and that's just fine. As I said earlier, overbrushing is also really useful for quickly applying paint to terrain pieces where the speed of the technique, while still accentuating the texture and details of the model, are great for painting big structures as fast as possible. So that's the first colour sorted, time to move on to the next colour, and for me that's going to be Overcast Blue. Now we have to decide what areas we're going to treat as separate panels to make a cool colour transition on. Let's say this whole area is one panel, and this sticky out bit at the rear is another panel. We'll treat these as separate sections for our gradients. Now let's go back to our regular dry brushing technique rather than overbrushing, so getting practically all the paint off the brush, and then starting from the top of each unique section that we just pointed out, we're going to dry brush in little circular motions. Not a huge amount of pressure, quite a soft touch, but our aim here isn't to instantly get the colour we want, but to build it up slowly from the top down and trying to make it more intense at the top. As we go down, we want to make sure that we pay less attention to the bottom of each section, leaving lots of the initial storm grey colour showing through in my case. So that's the big section done. Now let's move over to the little section, treating it just like the other one, so brighter at the top and less intense at the bottom. Alright, looking good so far. Now let's move on to the next colour, and that's going to be snow blue. Now, this is as bright as we want to go on this colour transition, so we need to be a bit more careful with this one. This paint is also very opaque, so we'll go on quite strong. So just like before, working the paint into the brush, testing it out on something with texture so we know we're not going to get any accidental big splodges or streaks of paint, and then starting from the top, just working in soft circular motions downwards. Now, we only really want to focus on the top third here. We can go below this zone, but we want to be incredibly careful, really just adding a soft touch to these rivets and other texture elements, just to add a bit of a contrast pop to the edges, but not to tone the flat panel on the tank. And now let's do the same on the smaller section too. As you can see, this is a really good way of building up a cool transition base coat on big models, and is a great starting point for working on other details, painting trim, recess shading, weathering, stuff like that. Sometimes when you're dry brushing, you'll kick up a little bit of paint dust that settles in the nooks and crannies and can make things look a little bit messy. To easily remove this, just give everything a once over with a lightly dampened brush. Just make sure there's no paint on it. You can also use this transition technique on smaller infantry models too, and it's a great way of doing colour fades. For example, let me show you using this Nighthaunt ghost dude from Games Workshop. Let's say you want to give your army a cool purple to red fade. Let's prime it with black so the undersides are going to be nice and dark. And now let's choose some colours. Again, ideally you'd probably want 3, your goal colours for each side of the transition, so this bold red and this rich purple for me, and you're also going to want a mid-tone that works with both colours. I'm going to use this wine red, but if you don't have loads of paints to choose from, don't worry, just mix your 2 gold colours together in equal parts to make your mid-tone. However you go about getting the middle colour, let's start off by overbrushing this mid-tone onto the model. We don't care so much about preserving the details here, we just want to get the paint on a bit faster and more opaque than just dry brushing, so we're going to overbrush. Once that's definitely all dry, we can then start dry brushing the other colours. I like to start from the darker colour, so purple in this case, and starting from the bottom of the swooshy fabric, I'm going to softly dry brush in circular motions again, working my way up to the centre of the model where the paint will start to become less effective because we've already worked off lots of the paint onto the bottom. So it won't cover quite as much, but just get softer and softer and lighter as you go up until you're basically leaving no paint on the model. Now let's switch to the red and basically do the same thing but starting on the head, working down the center of the model using exactly the same techniques as before. Boom! Easy, fast color transitions. Now you can add dry brush highlights just as you normally would to bring out any sharp edges or textures. To get an appropriate color for stuff like this, all I tend to do is add a tiny bit of off-white to whatever color you're trying to highlight. So for the head, I'll add a little bit of off-white into the bold red I use to make a highlight color, and then just do a very sparing dry brush highlight to catch the details on the head. Nice! Now you might be thinking, cool, I've done some dry brushing, but now I've got loads of really dusty, crusty brushes with paint all up in them. How am I supposed to clean them? They're all dry already. And honestly, that's a great question. Here are a few ways you can do it. First, if you're just using cheap synthetic brushes or makeup brushes, isopropyl alcohol is going to be your best bet here. It's really cheap to buy, and you can decant some into a little container, a shot glass or a lid or something like that, and let the tip of the brush soak up the alcohol for a few seconds. Don't let it soak up into this part, the ferrule, otherwise it might start loosening up the glue that holds the bristles in place. Once it's soaked for a few seconds, start wiping the brush against something absorbent and slightly abrasive like some kitchen towel or a rag, and then just repeat the alcohol dipping and cleaning steps until no colour is left behind when you clean it, and your brush should be nice and clean. If you're using fancier animal hair brushes, cleaning in alcohol still works, but it can degrade the bristles over time. Instead, use some brush soap like this. Wet your brush, smoosh it around in the soap, and then wipe away on something absorbent. Rinse and repeat until no colour comes off the brush. If you need to clean your brushes now and you don't have any of this stuff, just try using regular shampoo. The same stuff as you wash your hair with. You are cleaning hair after all. Wet the brush, and then just rub in a tiny bit of shampoo with your fingers, leave it for a minute or so to loosen up the paint, and then start wiping the shampoo off on something absorbent. Give it a little rinse in water, and when you're done, it should be good as new, and dandruff free. If you have limited brushes at your disposal, you can also quickly clean brushes like this in between dry brushing different colours. If your brush is still really wet from cleaning, just give it a quick blast with a hairdryer to get the excess moisture out. Another awesome way to use dry brushing is, rather than doing circular or side-to-side motions with the brush, doing directional highlights by only moving your brush in one direction over the model. This is a great way of simulating the way a stark or directional light would fall over a model. It's really good for moody, grimdark colour schemes. You can also use this technique on lighting. Basically just start with your brush on the light source and then flick it outwards, only doing the away motion and not any of the return motions. You can also reinforce the strength of the light by doing little circular motions around the light source itself. I mean, you see how easy that was? That took hardly any time at all. If you want a more in-depth look at how to do this, I covered it in the channel's second ever video, so be sure to check out that link when you get a chance. Another way I use dry brushing is to add really fast texture highlights on models I'm speed painting. For example, on the Hero Quest models I'm painting at the moment, I generally give them a few really simple base coat colours and then dry brush pretty much the whole model using an off-white paint. Now, if you just left it like this, you're going to have a really strange, dusty, kind of chalky look to the models because an off-white is a bit of a stark highlight for a lot of the colours, especially the darker ones. What you can do to remedy this is to add a thinned wash or shade paint to the whole model afterwards. This will not only add some depth to the recesses, but also tone down that starker highlight, making it gel with the vibe of the model a bit more. If you want to do this in a more precise way, instead of using a wash, you can thin down a regular paint to a glaze or a wash consistency, and then apply them over the top of any starkly dry brushed areas to smooth out the highlights in a way that's more sympathetic to the colours underneath. This obviously takes a bit more time though, as you have to go through each colour element separately. On some models, you might want to dry brush something that's quite precise or small without spilling onto other areas. You can absolutely do this, and I know this might sound silly or maybe a bit obvious, but you just need to use a smaller brush. Same technique, but smaller movements and a bit more precision. If you don't have a small dry brush, no problem. I bet you've got a brush like this. It used to be decent, you used to use it all the time, but now it's basically useless. Just give it a little haircut until you've got a little nub of bristles a few millimeters long, trim the edges so it's slightly rounded, and now you're good to go. Now it should be easy to hit things like skin without the risk of getting any flesh tone on surrounding clothes or armour. One of the last dry brushing tips that I'd like to share with you in this video is that it's a fantastic way of painting metal elements and also getting tarnished, dirty metal looks as well. For basic weapons, start with a black primer or base coat, and then dry brush your favourite gunmetal or silver paint over it. I mean, that's kind of it, it's almost magic, right? Use a lighter, brighter silver, a bit more sparingly on top of that for an extra level of realism too. Golds look great over a brown base coat like this, and for a dirty metal look, go for a sparing silver dry brush over any fully painted metal armour panels. Just try to catch the edges, and look at that. It works over any darker colour, but I particularly love it over ruddy, rusty brown. So easy and super effective. But finally, I just wanted to dispel the myth that dry brushing is a beginner-only technique. I've been painting on and off for about 30 years and I use it all the time. I dry brush loads of stuff on my Mosrog Scragbad, which won a Golden Demon finalist pin in 2023. And yeah, I know, sure, I'm not a Golden Demon winner, but I know someone who is. Mamikon. Let's see if he uses dry brushing.
Hello Guy, I can confirm that I have been using dry brush on some of my Golden Demon winning pieces, and as long as it is done properly, there is absolutely no problem with it. So keep on dry brushing. And subscribe to my Patreon.
So there you go, from the horse's mouth. Anyone tells you that dry brushing is for beginners only is talking nonsense. I hope this video has given you loads of inspiration, guidance, and food for thought, but most of all, I hope you're excited to try out your new skills. Please hit the like button if you found this video useful, maybe share it with a friend who could use these tips too. And this video was massively shaped by our awesome supporters on Patreon who posed loads of questions and shared their personal top tips for dry brushing, particularly these legends on screen right now. And our supporters over on Patreon are incredible. Their monthly support is our most dependable, regular source of income for the channel. Now, if you want to support the channel too, so we can continue to make useful videos like this for the whole miniature painting community, follow the link in the description to sign up from just £2 a month. One of the benefits from signing up, aside from access to our awesome Discord server and behind the scenes fun stuff, is that you get a shout out when you sign up too, just like these new members. Lasse Panduro Reneshe, Ether Vapor, Lol LimeWire 1911, Miles Minis, Sean Ritchie, Your New Best Friend, Granny Weatherwax, Stuart Townend, Barnes and Bears, Kamikaze, Dave Macy, Monkey in the Rain, Snibblington, and Captain Productivity. Also, Patreon members get a tasty 15% discount on our merch store, which has, by the way, just been restocked with loads of cool new merch, new stickers, new t-shirts, and our small and mediums on the classic Midwinter Minis logo are back in stock too. So if you want to let everyone know about your exceptional taste in miniature painting YouTube channels, you know what to do. Enormous thanks to Ravaged Star for sponsoring this video. I hope you enjoyed seeing something other than Games Workshop models be painted in a video for a change. Now don't forget to check out the link pinned in the comments in the description if you want to pick up any of that stuff for yourself. And thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.